Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment we introduced the Z scale as well as the communication types on the Z scale. In this segment we will begin exploring each of the communication types in more detail, beginning with metaphysical communication. When the processing related to the Z scale becomes active, that activation begins at -180 characteristics of communication. The dynamics of vertical thinking will apply to each characteristic at this level in order for a person to experience each cycle of communication. Previously we discussed vertical thinking concerning the Z0 scale. At that time we introduced the idea of the requirement of an impulse, a subtraction and a compression in order to complete a communication cycle. On the Z scale, each negative step has the same requirement. That is, in order to move from -180 characteristics to -181 characteristics, a person must experience an impulse, a subtraction and a compression. In this sense, the completed cycle of communication will increase the negative number of communication cycles being processed at any given time, with -180 being the starting point of that process. In metaphysical communication on the scale of post-intelligent impulse, though, the impulse that leads to the beginning of that communication cycle is not expressly required to begin from some sort of environmental factor. In post-intelligent impulse, the impulse can be caused by an internal factor such as the processing of a hormone, neurotransmitter, emotion, or likewise. In an abnormal sense, things like medications, drugs, alcohol, medication and other substances can lead to the requirement that an impulse be experienced. Those circumstances will be discussed later. For now, we can assume that some sort of natural physiological factor will cause the impulse. This is the physical part of communication which has its origins from within the brain or body. The other possibility is that the impulse begins a communication cycle as a response to the environment or as a response to another person's prompt for communication. In that way, the cycle of communication will be caused by some external factor, relating to the meta aspect. These together, the external and internal factors which lead to the initiation of a communication cycle, are the basis for the term metaphysical in metaphysical communication. These factors can lead to either the beginning, middle or end of a communication cycle as well as the constructive experience of each. From there, the information must be sorted within that communication cycle in a way that adds up to the interval ratio unit of communication. If either of those fail, though, a non-standard process can be expected, which will be discussed later. In a constructive sense, the communication that a person experiences is based on a combination of these internal and external factors. These occur until the communication is completed or is perpetuated until some other factor ends the communication. Each cycle related to the situation will result in an additional negative characteristic of communication, the first cycle moving from -180 to -181. Each of these cycles contains an interval ratio unit amount of information or an interval unit subtraction. If the cycle requires more consideration or an additional cycle, the communication would move from -181 to -182 with an interval ratio unit of information. With an additional cycle, the communication would move from -182 to -183 and so on. Constructively, the range of metaphysical communication extends from -180 to -185, with the processing of -185 characteristics leading to the vertical gap. The vertical gap is a physiological response similar to the phenomenon at the top of the R scale. Within the constructive range, though, there is the capacity to apply up to 4.5 cycles of communication back-to-back without experiencing this physiological phenomenon. These 4.5 processes work together to address the factors associated with the communication. Beyond these 4.5 processes, though, the experience of the vertical gap can be expected. Before that, though, any meaningful initiation of communication can occur within the 4.5 cycle range. After the gap, the capacity changes, namely, the capacity for the compression or express storage of these processes becomes quite difficult. The communication after the vertical gap is regularly expected to fail in terms of successfully compressing the information related to the communication cycles. For this reason, the communication is no longer considered metaphysical at that point and is instead referred to as impulsive communication. Please join me in the next segment to discuss more about impulsive communication on the Z scale.